Welcome to another episode of the School Sucks podcast. Super happy that you are joining us for another episode. If this is your first time with us, this is a place where we have conversations about rethinking education so that no kid ever has to say school sucks ever again. So most of the time it is just me here with videos and resources and all kinds of stuff. But from time to time we have guests, and I am super excited that we have a guest today who is not from the United States, and I'm really excited about that because I like getting an international perspective on what's going on with school. I'm absolutely fascinated by the similarities in the way that innovators are talking about school all around the world. So I'm really excited to introduce you to my friend Karl Millsom. This is him. He is joining us from Indonesia, and is doing a lot of great work in education there, but I will let him introduce himself. So Karl, my first question for you is basically, who are you? Like, what do you do, and what drives that?
Hi, Mike. It's really good to be on, and it's good to be speaking with you. Yeah, a little bit about myself. As you said, I'm living here in Jakarta, Indonesia now. I've been here for about 12 years. And here I work with teachers and schools. And it's been quite the transition from when I first arrived here, and certainly when I was in the UK, education was not really where I initially thought I'd end up. Yeah. Although I was interested in working with children and working in the care field, I did some social work training and things like that early on, and decided to travel a little bit with with the training that I'd done and some of the skills that I developed, and ended up staying out here, as I say, for about 12 or 13 years now. So that's how I am where I am. I came out here thinking I'd be here for a year, and I ended up here until today. And I started out doing a bit of, kind of low grade teaching, and gradually turn that more professional. And now rather than teaching in schools, I actually don't teach as much anymore. I now work with teachers and schools to help them develop their standards, develop their curricula, develop their teaching competency. And that's really become my major passion of late, in the last few years really, is trying to improve the education system around me, and then more recently trying to do a similar thing on a more global scale with a broader network and community of teachers.
That's amazing. That is amazing. That's awesome. It's always exciting to hear that, and I think, for me, at one point, it dawned on me that maybe I can do more good for the school system by targeting teachers and administrators than focusing on my individual classrooms. So that's actually super inspiring to hear. So I want to know about your experience with school growing up. One of the things I always like to ask people that come on the show is like, did you love school growing up? Did you hate school growing up? What was school like for you when you grew up?
Yeah, didn't love school. I
thought so.
The tagline, or the title of your podcast pretty much sums it all up, I think. I didn't enjoy school, and I think school didn't really enjoy me. I was not a model student. I wasn't very liked by most of my teachers. There were a couple of teachers that I think that did take a liking to me, more in a kind of kind of rebellious kind of way. I think they enjoyed the way that I would play up. I wasn't, it's funny. I went to a school. I must admit, I went to a school in my secondary school years that was it's quite a well-reputed school in the UK, and so there were a lot of very high achievers there. And I always suspected that I was there on sort of to fill up a quota. So I was kind of, by comparison to a lot of my peers, a lot of my friends in school, I was perhaps the one of the rougher kids. But by comparison to the region, it was a very good school. And so I was perhaps the lower end of the school I was in. But I wasn't really naughty. There were some of the kids that I've worked with since, and some of the schools that I've worked with since. You've seen what real problems some schools can have.
Right.
I was just a bit insolent. I didn't enjoy being in school. I didn't get on with the teachers. I would answer back a lot, and of course, I found that sort of entertaining. I was a bit of a class clown type character, but also that contributed back to me not enjoying school very much, because I wasn't really getting the most out of the learning experience. I was more just kind of I was playing games and having a bit of fun. But as I mentioned, right to begin with, that really is why I never really expected to be in education. When I left, I couldn't wait to get out of school, and the idea of going back to school as a career just seemed to make no sense to me. I didn't like being there.
Same.
And so I couldn't wait to get out. So yeah, when I left, I was very glad to see the end of it, and it was a bit of a surprise to me when I later, now look back and think, how did that loop close? Because not a fan when I was a kid.
Hey, I'm I'm in the same boat. Sometimes I talk to students and I'm like, yeah, I've never left school, and I feel like I've always hated school, and I've just never left it. Yeah, so I'm curious. So you talked about the work that you do with teachers and with schools. In Indonesia, like what's the best thing that you see about the way school is going where you are?
That's a really good question. What's the best thing? I think probably it's tough to say, and I think unfortunately there's going to be a lot of sides to coins, because probably one of the best things is the diversity of schools, different types of schools, the range of schools that are available. Wow. But unfortunately, that would also be, potentially one of the negatives, because it means that there are some amazing schools to choose from, but also, some real bottom of the barrel schools. And it really depends on the background of the child as to what opportunities they have, and whether they're going to end up in one of those great schools or not, largely to do with whether they can afford the better schools or not, because there's a heavily privatized school system here. So if kids can afford to be in those schools, there really are, the facilities, the teachers, there's some amazing international schools here. But of course, the majority of the population does not go to those schools. That's a tiny minority. So there's some promise, and there are some great schools, and that variety, that diversity, and the different types of schools I've spent time in and seen what possibilities there are, is probably the major positive.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. And are these are most of them still are they mostly traditional model schools, or are they doing something different with the way they organize?
Yeah, mostly traditional. Even the better schools are, they're not radical in their approach to learning. They have better facilities, they have more qualified teachers, they're using international curricula. But I think the most radical you'd really expect to get here, and I use that term quite lightly, is perhaps using the IB, the International Baccalaureate curriculum, which is it's radical light. It's still a traditional approach to teaching and learning, but they have perhaps a more advanced curriculum, something a little bit more progressive, a little bit more holistic in their content. Yeah. But it's still quite traditional. And outside of those schools, it's a very, very traditional, very, very formal system here. Formal education is the only thing that really exists here, and they have a very formal mentality to it as well. So it's very, very focused on grades and test taking, and all of the things that we'd be familiar with from the US and the UK as well, but just in a very heavily formalized way here.
Yeah. So I mean, you've been in Indonesia long enough to I think really have a sense of this next question that I'm going to ask. I think in the US, and maybe even in the Western world period, we're seeing this wave of I guess really aggressive ideas in school reform, where we have schools like the one where I work, where there's no classrooms, and people are doing forest schools and all kinds of stuff. Given the value system in Indonesia, does that fit well with what society is like?
Yeah, no, it doesn't. You mean the more progressive approach? You mean, right?
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Like, I mean, like the way their schools are, like the more traditional.
Oh,
route,
yeah. No,
does
that's
that
right.
fit?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, it does. It's a perfect representation of almost everything about the culture, really. And that's obviously been one of the harder things for me in trying to bring change to the schools that I work with, and trying to inspire and encourage the teachers that I work with, is that it's kind of treading against the culture.
Right.
Because it's a very formal culture. It's a very, deferential culture. The social hierarchy is very heavily pronounced here. And so the idea of going against the institution, the idea of being different in a very collectivist culture as well, is all, especially challenging for the teachers, on top of the fact that, partly for those cultural reasons, partly just because of the history of the country. It's still a relatively young country, and various other things like that. It also means that the teachers aren't particularly well trained. Right. So you're often you're working with a teacher who you have obstacles in multiple directions. They're not particularly well trained. Their institution isn't supporting progress, and their cultural mindset is very traditional and conservative. And so when I come along to a school or to a teacher and try to introduce some more progressive approaches to teaching, you're combating all three of those and perhaps more barriers as well.
Yeah. So then, what would be step one in your conversation with a teacher?
Yeah, I try to approach my training the way that I approach my teaching, and what I'm trying to train them to become as teachers. I try to model it in the training that I do. And so questions are really my starting place for any of the teaching that I do, really. And I tend to think I'm quite good at kind of formulating and asking the questions that will get to the point,
Yeah.
So I tend to lead with questions, and I try to get the teachers just kind of thinking about their position and thinking about their experience, and try to get them, by answering questions and by thinking about their own experience, try to get them to identify some of the problems. And that can be, quite a long process with some teachers, and it can get a little bit kind of combative sometimes, because there's a lot of defense mechanisms around traditional and conservative thinking. A lot of it is about defending the position, right? It's about, this is the way it is, this is the way it should be, and we don't want anything to get in and change that.
Yeah.
And so trying to attack it from the outside is not really going to work. And so getting teachers to think about it from their own perspective, to question, to break things down for themselves, is really the only way.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I have a lot of conversations in the United States with teachers, and people ask me a lot, like, do you get a lot of hate online? And I'm like, actually, I don't. Like, I don't. This is a moment where people in the U.S. are like ready to hear this.
Yeah.
And I had a conversation with a woman from Israel. And she said, well, tell me about your school. And I said, oh, our first objective is to get kids to love school. And she was like, what? Nobody cares about that. Right. I learned very, very quickly, like, I've got it easy. And so I have a lot of respect for what you're doing in a place where where the traditional system is not only like embraced, but it is ingrained in the way that their way of life. I so much respect for that. So I think that's a beautiful segue into the next topic. You reached out to me and were like, hey, I'm creating this thing called the Rebel Teachers Network. And with a podcast like School Sucks, how can you not be a part of the Rebel Teachers Network? And I'm really excited about some of the people I've seen pop up that are also a part of it. So what can you say about the Rebel Teachers Network right now? Very, very new.
Yeah, very new, but very exciting for me, and very new, but very real in a way that
Yeah.
I didn't really expect it to be, if I'm honest. As with a few things that I've done recently, it started as sort of throwing an idea out on LinkedIn, where I'm quite active, and that's where you and I first
That's right.
connected, of course. I post on LinkedIn a lot of maybe some provocative posts. It's interesting you said you don't get much hate online. I don't get a lot, but I get a bit.
Yeah.
Sometimes my ideas are a little bit too provocative, I think, for some teachers, and often not teachers, but people who are kind of peripheral to the education world.
Yep.
So that's where I spend most of my time online, is on LinkedIn, and I like to, put out there whatever ideas I'm thinking of, to see what kind of responses it brings back. And a few times recently, I've, mentioned something like, "Oh, here's a loose idea. I wonder what people think about it," and I've just been overwhelmed by the response that I've received. And that was, for example, what happened with my own podcast. I sort of said, I think I put up a post just saying, I'm thinking about maybe talking to some people and recording it. What do you think? And within a couple of days, some 30 or 40 people had said, "Oh, I want to be on that," and I want to do it. And before I knew it, it was something I thought I might do in 6 months' time. And before I knew it, a couple of weeks later, I was already recording the first episode. And the same thing happened with this. From there, really, the idea grew, or has grown, into the Rebel Teacher Network, which is now, where my first podcast is. And I've also started a new one, which is to more represent the network itself. So I have the Talking Teaching podcast, where I just speak with teachers from different parts of the world and talk about different aspects of education and teaching as a more kind of classroom focused thing. And then the Rebel Teacher podcast is now a little bit more of a free space to explore some of the the more progressive ideas, again with teachers from different backgrounds. And the network began as a place for those to just kind of be centered in one place, 2 podcasts in one platform. But again, the response has been so positive, and I've been speaking to more people like yourself, and I'm just really excited by the response that I've seen, and really, really excited to be bringing people like you onto the network, so that we can really solidify the image, and what it is we're trying to be, which is essentially a platform for creative educators to come and put out content that represents this rebel image. And I've actually spent, I suppose, the last few weeks, most of my energy has been spent on trying to clarify what I mean by rebel, and in particular to assuage some of the concerns that is in some parts of the world obviously seen as quite a negative word.
Right.
Different countries have some quite different history with a word like rebel. And so I've been trying to calm some of that a little bit. So it's still growing, it's still becoming what it's going to be, but I've got some clear ideas about what I'd like it to be, and bringing people like you on to the network, I think is a great way to represent that idea. These are the kind of voices, these are the kind of ideas that we're all about, and the School Sucks podcast represents that perfectly.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So yeah, when I think about something like the Rebel Teacher Network, and what I was so excited about is, I started a group similar to that with just 10 people. And the reason why is because everybody is we're all, people who think differently about education, we're all in our different corners of the world, sort of just like plugging away. And it's very easy to think like, oh, I'm by myself. Like I'm alone in this, because the exact group that you mentioned, the people who are not necessarily in education, but like on the periphery, that is that's the group of people that they come after me and everybody else the hardest. And I think it's like, I think there's going to be some really amazing ideas, but also just an amazing community that comes out of the Rebel Teacher Network. So I'm really excited about that.
I think so. I hope so. Yeah, and you said about feeling kind of a little bit isolated. I was I've always been writing a lot. I like writing. Videos and spoken content is very new for me. Still getting used to it, really. I'm still just kind of developing my own approach to that. I'm not especially comfortable on the camera, so I've always been much more comfortable writing. I like to write, and so I've always put articles and posts out on LinkedIn and various other platforms, and I've always enjoyed engaging in the comments. Getting some feedback, getting some comments, getting some conversation started. For me, it's always been about the conversation. Less interested in the likes and the shares. I want to see what people think, and I want to inspire people to think. I want to sometimes have uncomfortable conversations if that's what seems necessary at the time. But for a long time it was just these articles, which I've enjoyed writing. But ultimately, the conversation around a particular article eventually dies down. You get a few comments, respond to those comments. Occasionally one will, pick up fire a little bit. But essentially, the week passes by and people have moved on to another conversation. I'll put out a new article, and that cycle continues, but doesn't really go anywhere. So I wanted to just more and more, I started to feel a need for it to lead to something, and to not just be a couple of comments attached to an article, but to be something that was actually having an impact, actually inspiring some change, getting some teachers active and doing things in their classroom and doing things in their network, their teaching community, and whatever else. So that's what I'm now trying to do. And like you said, being connected with people around the world means that you get a lot of different perspectives, and it's meant that it's put some of my ideas into perspective, thinking, okay, well, this might work here, but it might not work in every case. And there are some things that have to be localized, to suit the local community and to suit your needs. But what I'm really trying to do as much as possible is identify the universals, find out what things can apply, what things do make sense wherever in the world you are. Are there some things that as a global network or a global community we can all be working on for the benefit of our students? And that's what interests me most, I think.
Yeah. Do you just offhand, do you think you have one or two universals right now that you are pretty sure about?
Yeah, I think maybe some concepts at the moment, rather than they're not pithy little aphorisms, I think, at the moment. But right. One thing that I've really noticed, and one thing that again comes up against a bit of some pushback, is that for me, one of the things that I found most important and that I believe quite strongly in is that, tradition and culture don't have as big an impact on learning as people believe that they do. Wow. So they do have a big impact in the sense that they create they ingrain approaches and practices and systems, and it's hard to break those. It's hard to get out of them. Right. But I get a lot of response when I'll talk about an approach to teaching or a method, a methodology or something. I get a lot of responses saying, oh yeah, but the culture in my country is such that wouldn't work. And I try very hard, and especially living here, I've had to work hard on this to try and do what I want to do here in a country that is culturally very different from my mindset. What I work particularly hard on is isolating or dividing what we refer to as culture and what we refer to as tradition. Now, these are sort of my definition, so this is something that's not always easy to get across, and it's not a black and white thing either, but right. There are things that are culture, things that make up the character of a nation, things that the people identify strongly and positively with. And then there are traditions, which are often related, but they are a separate thing. Right. The behaviors, the practices, the systems that have developed in a nation, in a country, often developed from the culture, but they are separate. And I never feel like I'm in a place to criticize culture. You know, every country, every nation has its culture and has its different beliefs and so on. But I do think we should feel a little bit more comfortable criticizing tradition and, these practices that may not be conducive to progress and development. And so there are certain things here, you would look at all of the schools and see certain similarities. They're, for example, very authority centered, right? So the schools here are all about authority, all about conformity. And you would see that, apart from some of the international schools, almost every school is like that here. And, people would say, well, our culture doesn't allow for this, more student autonomy centered teaching. It doesn't fit our culture. I said, that's not really the culture. Nobody would really identify and say, the culture I'm proud of is that we don't allow individualism. Right. No one actually says that about their culture.
Exactly. Yeah.
So we can identify that as a byproduct, as a bug of the culture, and say, okay, how can we change that with, retaining the values of the culture?
Yeah.
Which are, deferential, respect, and various other, positive values. But can we break out and also allow, progress and development in the students? And so I think that's one of the important things. And that is something that, every country has its different traditions, has its different practices that we might want to break away. But at the core, how students learn and what means progress and what leads to progress, these are pretty universal. And once you can break out of the traditional molds and get to the core of the student and, the student's mind, the brain works the same way wherever you are in the world. Whatever culture you come from, wherever you were born, we all have the same brain. We all have the same learning processes, but tradition and culture sometimes gets in the way of that.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Especially the distinction between culture and tradition. I think that's the key. I really do. Because I hear that a lot as well. Like, oh yeah, that would never work here. Would never work there.
Right.
We're even talking about it on a smaller scale, from city to city in the state of Texas.
Sure, absolutely. I bet.
There's a guy from New York University. His name is David Kirkland, and he said, I don't care where you are on planet Earth. There is not a child that will not respond to being cared for. And it's like,
right, exactly right. Yeah.
And so
you might have, again, you might have an environment where when you look at it, you see that the way that the children are being cared for perhaps is a bit less nurturing for one reason or another.
Yeah.
But there's no culture in the world, at least none that I'm familiar with, that will say, no, in our culture, an important value for us is we don't care for our children.
Right.
No one's going to say that. No one's going to say that that's the benefit of their culture. So yeah, absolutely right. That's a good example.
Yeah. Well, I've enjoyed this chat. And if people want to, so you've mentioned a couple of things. You mentioned that you are on LinkedIn a lot. We met on LinkedIn. You mentioned 2 podcasts. So if people want to find you, where can they find more about you?
Yep. So I'm most active on LinkedIn, and I'm welcome connections there. It's where most of the conversations that I have take place. But the Rebel Teacher Network is currently primarily a YouTube channel. So if you go to youtube.com/Rebel Teacher Network, and that's where the videos and the podcasts currently live. There's no website yet, but there will be in the near future. And as I say, on the Rebel Teacher Network YouTube channel, there's currently the 2 podcasts that I run, and we've got more joining over time. Obviously, you'll be joining us, which I'm very excited about. And we've got 2 or 3 others starting in the next week or 2. So yeah, I look forward to seeing people there and getting some conversation started.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you so much for stopping by the School Sucks podcast.
Thanks for having me.
It has been great, and I think this is going to be a highly watched and listened to episode. my audience generally likes people when they're not from the U.S. Because
Yeah. Okay.
the difference in perspective is really nice. So
Yeah.
yeah.
That's
So
good.
yeah. So thanks, man.
Thanks a lot, Mike.